Following the 1954 Geneva Accords, French colonial rule in Indochina ended, splitting Vietnam at the 17th parallel. As the Cold War intensified, the United States viewed Southeast Asia through the lens of the domino theory. Washington feared that if South Vietnam fell to communist forces, the rest of Asia would inevitably follow. What began as financial aid and military advisors gradually escalated into full-scale military intervention under the Johnson administration. July 28, 1965. Inside the Oval Office, Washington, D.C., the air conditioning hummed softly, a stark contrast to the oppressive midsummer humidity choking the Capitol outside. President Lyndon B. Johnson leaned heavily over his mahogany desk, his massive frame shadowed by the soft glow of green-shaded lamps. Before him lay a map of Southeast Asia, a jagged strip of land bordered by the South China Sea. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his voice rhythmic, sterile and driven by data. He spoke of troop levels, kill ratios, and logistical pipelines. But Johnson wasn't looking at percentages. He was looking at a red stain that seemed to be spreading across the globe. To the United States government, Vietnam was not merely a country, it was a line in the sand. The geopolitical chess match against the Soviet Union and Chairman Mao's China had found its flashpoint. The prevailing doctrine was simple, rigid, and absolute: the domino theory. If the government in Saigon fell to the communist forces of the North, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and perhaps the entirety of South Asia would tumble next. Washington viewed the National Liberation Front, popularly known as the Viet Cong, not as a homegrown insurgency fighting a civil war, but as the aggressive tip of a global communist spear. The American presidency was haunted by the loss of China in 1949 and the bloody stalemate of Korea. No American president wanted to be responsible for losing Southeast Asia. "We will stand in Vietnam," Johnson announced to the press corps later that day. His voice carried a calculated resolve, but privately, the architects of the war harbored a quiet, gnawing anxiety. They were preparing to deploy the most technologically advanced military on Earth against a guerrilla force, confident that sheer American industrial might and strategic bombing Operation Rolling Thunder would force Hanoi to its knees. They calculated for numbers, logistics, and firepower. They failed to calculate for the terrain, the history, and the sheer willpower of an adversary fighting on their own soil. November 14, 1965. Landing zones: Ray, the Ia Drang Valley. The rhythmic, deafening thud of Huey helicopter blades sliced through the morning air, a sound that would soon become the permanent soundtrack to a generation of young Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Hall Moore stood by the open door of his chopper, looking down at a clearing nestled beneath the shadow of the Chupong Massif. The tall elephant grass below whipped violently in the rotor wash. The air smelled of crushed vegetation, aviation fuel, and beneath it all, the sharp, metallic tang of impending violence. "Go, go, go," Moore yelled as his boots hit the red dirt. Elements of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, the resurrected cavalry of Custer's legacy, deployed into the valley. It was the first major clash between regular United States Army troops and the regular North Vietnamese Army. Within minutes, the deceptive quiet of the valley shattered. From the high grass and the tree lines, a devastating crossfire erupted. The North Vietnamese forces, under the command of General Nguyen Huyen, utilized a terrifyingly effective tactic, clutching the enemy by the belt. They engaged the Americans at such close range that United States artillery and air support could not be called in without risking friendly casualties. "We've got contact. Heavy contact," screamed Specialist 4th Class Ernie Savage into his radio handset, his face pressed hard against the dirt as green tracer rounds snapped inches above his helmet. The noise was absolute chaos. The crackle of automatic rifles blended with the deeper thud of American 16s, punctuated by the agonizing screams of wounded men calling for corpsmen. For 3 days, the battle raged in a claustrophobic hellscape of heat and gunpowder. American soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy they could rarely see, an enemy that materialized from the foliage like ghosts and vanished just as quickly. When the smoke finally cleared over landing zones Ray, hundreds of men lay dead. The United States military claimed victory based on the body count, validating McNamara's statistical approach to war. But for the soldiers who crawled through the blood-soaked dirt of Ia Drang, the realization was far grimmer. The war would not be quick, it would not be clean, and the jungle belonged to the enemy. June 12, 1966. Operation Hawthorne. Near Tumarong, Central Highlands. The heat hit like a physical blow, a wet, suffocating 102 degrees that made the olive-drab fatigue shirts cling to the skin like wet canvas. Private First Class Raymond Torres wiped the stinging sweat from his eyes, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the plastic stock of his M16 rifle. Around him, the triple canopy jungle of the Central Highlands was an oppressive wall of green, blocking out the sun and trapping a stagnant soup of moisture and rot. "Keep your intervals, Horace," hissed Sergeant Miller from a few paces ahead. 5 yards. "Watch the brush." Horace nodded, his throat dry, despite the 2 canteens hanging from his web gear. They were moving through a valley floor covered in elephant grass, sharp, jagged blades that grew over 6 feet tall, completely swallowing a man. The only sound was the rhythmic swish-swish of their jungle boots cutting through the vegetation and the low, heavy breathing of the platoon. The jungle went entirely silent. The birds stopped chirping. The constant buzz of cicadas vanished. Torres froze. His eyes scanned the wall of green just 3 feet in front of him. There was no wind, yet a patch of grass 20 yards to his left gently swayed. It wasn't a violent rustle, just a subtle, rhythmic ripple that moved sideways, contrary to the natural slope of the terrain. The grass was moving. Ambush. Miller's shout was cut short by the devastating, metallic roar of a Chinese Type 56 automatic rifle opening up at point-blank range. The world dissolved into a blinding flash of green traces and white smoke. The Viet Cong were invisible, dug into spire holes and hidden trenches beneath the root systems of massive banyan trees. They wore black pajamas and helmets woven from the very grass Torres had been watching. "Man down. Get up here." Torres threw himself into the mud, firing blindly into the shaking foliage. The air tore apart with the concussive blasts of Soviet-made grenades. He couldn't see a single enemy soldier. He was fighting a landscape. The American troops were targets in a shooting gallery where the walls themselves fired bullets. For the teenage conscripts of the American infantry, the Vietnam's jungle became a living, hostile entity. The enemy wasn't just the soldier in the trench, it was the bamboo that hid tripwires, the mud that harbored leeches, and the deceptive, moving grass that whispered of a sudden, violent death. September 24, 1966. Base Camp, Lai. A low, guttural growl broke the silence of the perimeter wire. Corporal Thomas Fletcher knelt in the red dust, his hand buried deep in the thick German shepherd fur of Prince, a 60-pound military working dog assigned to the 25th Infantry Division's scout dog platoon. Prince's ears were locked forward, his nostrils twitching as he sampled the heavy night air wafting across the perimeter's concertina wire. "What is it, hey?" Fletcher whispered, his voice barely audible. Prince didn't bark. Scout dogs were trained to be silent sentries. Instead, the dog raised his hackles, his body stiffening into a rigid pointer stance. Somewhere out in the pitch-black void beyond the flares, where the jungle met the cleared fire zone, the Viet Cong were probing the American defenses. The United States military deployed over 4,000 dogs to Vietnam: German shepherds, Labradors, and mixed breeds. They were the unsung eyes and ears of the infantry, serving as scouts, frackers, and sentries. They could smell a human scent from hundreds of yards away, detect the faint aroma of fish sauce favored by the local guerrillas, and spot the microscopic disturbance of soil that indicated a buried booby trap or an unexploded mortar shell. "Tripwire," Fletcher muttered to the patrol leader, pointing toward where Prince's gaze was locked. Just a foot off the trail, hidden beneath a layer of damp leaves, lay a rusted artillery shell rigged with a friction fuse, tied to a nearly invisible length of green fishing line. Had Prince not alerted, the platoon would have walked straight into a blast radius that would have torn them to pieces. The bond between handler and dog was absolute, in a war defined by isolation, confusion, and shifting loyalties. These animals offered unconditional devotion. They saved thousands of American lives, walking point ahead of the platoons, taking the first risks in the dark. But as Fletcher rubbed Prince's ears, watching the dog's eyes track the jungle line, he had no idea of the bureaucracy of war awaiting them. To the Department of Defense, these living, breathing lifesavers were classified under a cold, utilitarian designation: military surplus equipment. And when the time came for the Americans to leave, the fate awaiting these loyal companions would become one of the darkest, most forgotten tragedies of the entire conflict. January 18, 1967. Hu Chai District. The corpse. The sun beat down like an anvil, but Corporal Randy Cooper was looking into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the light. He knelt before a hole in the earth, barely 2 feet wide, framed by the jagged roots of a destroyed rubber tree. The opening had been completely hidden beneath a trapdoor disguised with leaves and mud until a soldier's foot had accidentally crashed through it. You re-up, the platoon leader muttered, not looking him in the eye. Cooper swallowed hard, his throat tightening. At 5'4" and 130 pounds, the native of Pittsburgh was built perfectly for the worst job in Vietnam. He was a tunnel rat. He stripped off his heavy flak jacket, his wedge gear, and his helmet. All he took was a standard-issue green-shaped flashlight, a pair of wire cutters, and a 45 caliber Colt pistol. The heavy automatic was notoriously loud in confined spaces, its concussive blast capable of shattering a man's eardrums inside the earth, but Cooper preferred its stopping power. He clicked on the flashlight, bit the barrel of the Colt, and lowered himself, feet first, into the hole. The transition from the blinding tropical heat to the subterranean world was instantaneous. The air became thick and smelled overwhelmingly of old sweat, rotting vegetation, and stale smoke. The tunnel walls squeezed against his shoulders. It was a claustrophobia so intense it felt like being buried alive. Cooper dropped to his belly and began to crawl. The flashlight beam cut a fragile path through the airborne dust. Every inch was a gamble. The Viet Cong designed these tunnels with lethal ingenuity. Cooper's fingers lightly swept the floor ahead, searching for the telltale resistance of a taut wire. A fraction of an inch more pressure could trigger a tripwire connected to a rusted grenade or release a trapdoor, dropping him onto feces-tipped bamboo punji stakes. Suddenly, his flashlight beam caught a subtle movement. The scorpion, disturbed by his intrusion, scurried across the dirt wall. Cooper froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But scorpions and venomous vipers deliberately placed by the Viet Cong as living booby traps were only secondary fears. He heard it before he saw it, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound just around a sharp U-bend in the tunnel. Human breathing. Cooper silently turned off his flashlight. The darkness became a physical weight. He held his breath, leveling the Colt 45 into the black void. In these tunnels, there were no battle lines, no grand strategies, and no air support. It was a primitive, primeval war of survival, fought inches apart in the dark, where the winner was simply the one who fired first. May 17, 1967. Operation Hickory, demilitarized zone. The concussive shockwave of a 500-pound bomb dropped by a distant 52 Strata fortress rippled through the soles of Marine Corporal David Vance's boots. Even miles away from the target zone, the earth trembled. Vance lay prone on a red dirt ridge overlooking a valley that had been completely stripped of its skin by defoliants and artillery fire. The scenery was apocalyptic. What had once been a lush, vibrant green canopy was now a charred wasteland of grey stumps and craters that filled with stagnant rainwater. Vance adjusted the scope of his MFT sniper rifle. His eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion. For 48 hours, his unit had been taking sporadic sniper fire from a tree line across the gorge. The North Vietnamese regular army forces they were facing along the demilitarized zone were highly disciplined, heavily armed, and completely distinct from the regional guerrillas of the south. They fought with standard artillery, mortars, and a stubborn refusal to yield. "Watch the tree line, at 2 o'clock, his spotter whispered, adjusting his binoculars. Near the burned-out clearing. Through his scope, Vance saw a landscape reduced to its bare mechanics. The war along the demilitarized zone had devolved into something reminiscent of the Western Front in 1916, a brutal, grinding stalemate of artillery duels, entrenched positions, and human wave assaults in the mud. A sudden flash of light caught Vance's eye, the lens glare of an enemy scope. Before he could react, a supersonic round snapped past his ear, embedding itself into the sandbag behind him with a sharp thwack. "Get down," Vance hissed, pulling back behind the berm. The air was suddenly torn apart by the deafening roar of incoming 122mm rockets. The North Vietnamese artillery was firing from deep within the neutral zone, their positions fortified inside caves that American airstrikes struggled to penetrate. The ground erupted in geysers of red clay and shrapnel. Vance curled into a ball, pressing his face into his arms, feeling the hot blast wave wash over his back. In this theater of the war, the Americans were no longer the hunters. They were trapped in static outposts like Yisan and Containment, targets for an adversary who possessed an endless supply of patience and artillery. The illusion of a swift, technologically superior victory was buried deep under the mud of the demilitarized zone. January 31, 1968. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Headquarters, 2nd. The crisp, clean uniform of military police specialist 4th Class Marcus Evans was ruined, soaked through with sweat, and stained with black carbon. He knelt behind a concrete planter outside the main courtyard of the United States Embassy complex in downtown Saigon. The night air, usually filled with the sounds of firecrackers celebrating the Lunar New Year holiday of Tet, was torn apart by the deafening, erratic chatter of automatic weapons. They're inside the courtyard. They blew the wall. Someone screamed over the tactical radio nets, the signal choked with static and panic. A 19-man Viet Cong sapper commando unit had blasted a hole through the thick outer compound wall with a plastic explosive charge, killing the 2 military police guards at the gate. Evans jammed a fresh magazine into his carbine, his eyes wide with disbelief. This was Saigon, the heart of supposedly secure American territory. The military command structure had spent months assuring the press that the communist forces were spent, starving, and incapable of large-scale operations. Looking through the smoke, Evans saw green tracer rounds ricocheting off the white facade of the American Chancellery building. The firefight was chaotic and blind, fought at point-blank range in the shadows of the embassy grounds. Evans fired until his barrel was scorching hot, thinned down by an enemy who had brought the war directly to the doorstep of the American diplomatic mission. By dawn, all 19 attackers lay dead or captured, their blood pooling on the manicured lawns. But the damage was already done. The image of dead guerrillas lying on the grounds of the United States Embassy flashed onto television screens across America, shocking a public that had been told victory was just around the corner. The Tet Offensive unmasked the reality: the enemy was not defeated, and the war was nowhere near its end. February 15, 1968. The Citadel, Hue City. The sky over the ancient imperial capital of Hue was a bleak, monolithic grey. Rain dripped from the shattered clay tiles of a destroyed pagoda where Marine Sergeant Thomas Vance hunkered down. The air was thick with the stench of pulverized brick, burning cordite, and the sweet, sickening smell of decaying bodies that had lain in the streets for 2 weeks. "Move up! Fire on that window!" Vance roared, his voice hoarse from shouting over the din of battle. The battle, for Hugh, was a brutal, block by block, room by room urban meat grinder, a stark departure from the jungle fighting of the previous years. North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong forces had seized the historic citadel, digging themselves into fortifications built into the ancient, thick stone walls. The Marines had to clear them out foot by foot. An Ontas tracked vehicle crawled into the narrow street, its 6 106mm recoilless rifles swiveling toward a North Vietnamese machine gun nest. The concussive blast blew out Vance's eardrums as the building across the street collapsed into a cloud of red dust. Vance sprinted forward, his boots splashing through grey puddles and blood. As he threw himself against the doorway of a ruined home, his eyes caught the forms of civilian families huddled in the corner, terrified, covered in plaster dust, clinging to their children. The civilian cost of the Tet Offensive was devastating. Thousands of innocents were killed in the crossfire, caught between American airstrikes that leveled entire neighborhoods to save them, and the systematic executions carried out by communist forces during their brief occupation of the city. As Vance looked into the dead eyes of a young boy lying in the rubble, the absolute horror of the war hit him with a cold, paralyzing weight. The strategic victories, the body counts, and the political rhetoric meant nothing down here in the dirt. There was only survival, and the profound, mounting tragedy of a country being torn to pieces. March 16, 1968. Sun, my village, Hoang Ngai Province. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the rice paddies of Pinkvale, an American military nickname for a heavily mined stronghold in Hoang Ngai. The rotor wash from a fleet of troop-carrying Huey helicopters whipped the surface of the water into white foam as Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, touched down. Private First Class Dale Larson jumped into the knee-deep muck of a paddy, his heart racing. His company had been taking heavy casualties from snipers and booby traps for weeks without ever seeing a flesh and blood enemy. Just days prior, a popular sergeant had been blown to pieces by a rigged mortar shell. The platoon was a tinderbox of grief, boiling anger, and exhaustion. "We go in hot," the briefing had told them. "Everything in there is Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers." Larson advanced toward the sub-hamlet of My Lai with his rifle at the ready. The village was quiet, the smell of wood smoke and morning cooking fires drifting through the coconut palms. There was no incoming fire. No snipers opened up from the tree lines. Instead of an army, the soldiers found only old men, women, and crying children preparing their morning rice. But the command structure was broken, poisoned by a cold obsession with the body count. Within minutes, the operation fractured into absolute madness. "Gather them up," came the shouts from leadership. Larson watched in paralyzed horror as soldiers began dragging civilians from their thatch-roofed homes. Orders were barked, orders that defied every law of war, every shred of basic human decency. Men began firing into the crowds of huddled villagers. Fire into them. Kill them all. An old man attempting to explain that they were not Viet Cong was bayoneted. A group of women huddled together, shielding their toddlers, were sprayed with automatic fire from 16 rifles. Larson saw a line of over 100 villagers pushed into a muddy drainage ditch at the edge of the hamlet. A young lieutenant stepped up to the lip of the trench and opened fire, instructing his men to do the same. The air filled with the deafening, frantic pop of American rifles, the screams of the dying, and the smell of copper and burning thatch. A few soldiers refused to fire, others wept as they pulled their triggers, swept up in a collective, dark hysteria that transformed disciplined soldiers into executioners. By the time a heroic American helicopter pilot, Warrant Officer Huff Thompson, landed his chopper between the rampaging soldiers and the remaining civilians to halt the slaughter, over 500 innocent people lay dead in the mud of My Lai. The military chain of command immediately buried the reports, hiding the massacre under a layer of bureaucratic falsification, labeling it a victory against a heavily armed enemy. But truth has a way of bleeding through the cracks. When the story finally broke to the world more than a year later, the photographs of the drainage ditch filled with the bodies of children shattered the conscience of the American public. The moral high ground was gone, swallowed by the darkness of a war that was stripping away the humanity of everyone it touched. August 14, 1969. Fire Support Base Ripcord, the Ia Drang Province. The rain fell in a steady, maddening drone, turning the clay of the hilltop outpost into a slit, red grease. Specialist 4th Class James Miller sat in a sandbagged bunker, staring at a small white pill resting in the palm of his hand. It was a standard vitamin, a complex issued by the medic, but next to it lay a small vial of clear liquid he had bought for $2 in the bars of Anki. The strain of the war was no longer just tactical, it was psychological. The United States Army in Vietnam was beginning to unravel from within. With the Nixon administration announcing the first troop withdrawals under the policy of Vietnamization, turning the fighting over to the South Vietnamese Army, ground combat troops faced a grim, demoralizing question: who wants to be the last man to die for a mistake? Discipline was fracturing. In the rear echelons, and increasingly at the remote fire bases, pure Southeast Asian heroin and marijuana became an escape from the terrifying reality of night patrols and the unrelenting artillery duels. "Miller, Sergeant wants you on the perimeter line," a voice called out from the rain. Miller did not move for a long moment. He felt a profound sense of isolation, disconnected from a home front that hated the war, led by officers who seemed to be fighting for career advancement rather than a clear objective. The practice of fragging, using an unregistered fragmentation grenade to assassinate over-aggressive or unpopular officers, was becoming an open secret in the barracks. The American military machine, the most formidable fighting force on Earth, was rusting from the inside out, trapped in an unending war, without a front line, without a clear purpose, and without an exit strategy. December 4, 1971. Da Nang Air Base, a corpse. The blinding glare of airport floodlights cut through the midnight haze of aviation exhaust and coastal salt air. Corporal Thomas Fletcher stood on the concrete tarmac, his duffel bag slung over his left shoulder, his right hand gripping a rusted chain link fence. A few hundred yards away, the massive silver fuselage of a commercial World Airways Boeing 707 sat idling, its jet engines whining a high-pitched song of escape. He was going home. He had his Freedom Bird ticket in his pocket, but his chest felt hollowed out, empty and heavy as lead. "Move it along, Corporal." Boarding by manifest numbers only, a logistics sergeant barked, checking names off a clipboard near the boarding stairs. Fletcher did not move. He looked back toward the row of temporary wooden kennels near the base perimeter. Inside one of them was Prince. The German Shepherd had spent 2 years walking point for Fletcher's squad. Prince had taken shrapnel in his shoulder from a claymore mine, had smelled 3 ambushes before they sprang, and had slept curled against Fletcher's side during the terrifying monsoon nights when the world seemed made of mud and artillery fire. Fletcher had begged his commanding officer to let him pay for Prince's passage back to OEO. He had offered his entire combat savings. The answer had been a cold, bureaucratic stamp denied. Under military regulations dictated by the Department of Defense and the Department of Agriculture, military working dogs were classified as surplus military equipment. Fearing the introduction of tropical diseases like canine hemorrhagic fever to the United States, and unwilling to fund the massive quarantine and transport logistics for thousands of animals, the government barred them from returning home. Of the roughly 4,000 dogs that served in Vietnam, only an estimated 200 returned to the United States. The rest were met with a grim, tragic accounting. Hundreds were turned over to the South Vietnamese army, where supplies were already critically low, and dogs were often viewed through a different cultural lens regarding animals. The majority of the remaining dogs were simply led into military veterinary clinics across the country. They were put down euthanized by the very military they had served with unwavering, fierce loyalty. Fletcher. Last call. Get on the damn plane. Fletcher wiped a sudden rush of hot tears from his face, turning his back on the kennels. As he climbed the metal stairs into the pressurized cabin of the civilian airliner, he could hear the distant, collective howling of the hounds through the roar of the jet engines. He was leaving the hell of Vietnam behind, but a piece of his soul was staying in the cages, abandoned by the nation that had called them to serve. April 29, 1975. The Defense Attach Office Compound, Saigon. The sky over Saigon was stained with black pillars of smoke from the burning fuel dumps at Tan Son Hut Air Base. The end was no longer a slow drawdown, it was a chaotic, panicked collapse. Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history, was underway. Marine Sergeant Marcus Evans stood on the roof of the compound, his M16 rifle pointed toward a surging, desperate crowd of thousands of Vietnamese civilians pressing against the chain-link gates below. They held up old identity cards, birth certificates, and slips of paper proving they had worked for the Americans, begging, screaming to be let inside before the tanks of the North Vietnamese army breached the city limits. The air was filled with the deafening, frantic roar of massive Jolly Green Giant helicopters landing on the reinforced rooftops, their rotors kicking up a storm of gravel and discarded paperwork. Keep them back. Do not let them rush the ramp. Evans shouted to his fire team, his voice cracking with exhaustion. The scene was a visceral, heartbreaking testament to a broken promise. For over a decade, the United States had poured its wealth, its technology, and its young blood into this soil, promising a stable, democratic ally. Now, the remnants of that promise were being shoved off helicopter ramps to make room for American personnel. Evans watched as a South Vietnamese officer, tears streaming down his face, stripped off his uniform right there in the street, throwing his pistol into the gutter to avoid execution by the incoming victorious forces. On the radio, the static-choked voice of the embassy security detachment reported that the last helicopter was lifting off from the United States Embassy roof, leaving hundreds of loyal local employees behind in the courtyard. As Evans' own helicopter lifted off, banking sharply over the Mekong Delta, he looked down at the city below. The streets were filled with abandoned military gear, boots, helmets, uniforms discarded by an army that had dissolved in a matter of weeks. It was the final, agonizing frame of a tragic film. The American war in Vietnam was over, leaving behind a scarred landscape, a deeply divided home front, and the haunting ghosts of an intervention that had cost more than 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese casualties.